Forget horned helmets and polite raids. Today we're diving into the dark heart of Viking warfare. These were the men who fought with no armour, no fear, and no mercy. The ones who were said to be possessed by animal spirits, biting their shields, howling like wolves, and cutting down enemies in a trance-like rage. They were the berserkers. Who were they really? Warriors? Madmen? Or something else entirely? Let's unravel the myth, the history, and the terrifying legend of the Viking berserker. The word berserker comes from Old Norse, berserker, and depending on interpretation, it means either bear shirt or bear shirt. Both are accurate. Berserkers either wore bear pelts into battle or nothing at all. No chainmail, no fear, just raw fury. They were a special class of Viking warrior. Not just skilled in combat, they were spiritual weapons. Berserkers believed they could channel the power of wild beasts, bears, wolves, and boars, by entering a trance called berserkergang, or going berserk. In this state, they would scream, shake, gnaw on their shields, and launch into battle with a strength said to rival 10 men. According to the Icelandic sagas, enemies who saw a berserker charge would often flee in terror before the fight even began. It wasn't just bravado, these warriors were feared for a reason. Some accounts say they felt no pain, that they could be stabbed or burned and keep fighting. And while that might sound mythical, even ancient kings like Harald Fairhair kept berserkers as elite bodyguards. Let's set the scene. The battlefield is quiet. Cold breath hangs in the air. And then, you hear it. A low growl. Not from a wolf or a bear, but from a man. Or something that used to be a man. Suddenly, out of the fog, they charge. Men with wild eyes, clad in the fur of beasts, or wearing nothing at all. No armour, no shields, just axes, fury. And an unholy scream that makes your blood run cold. These were the berserkers. Now the name itself? It's Old Norse. Berserker. Some scholars translate it as bear shirt, suggesting these warriors wore bear pelts into battle to channel the power of the beast. Others believe it means bear shirt, pointing to the terrifying idea that they fought without armour, stripping down to show they feared neither blade nor death. Either way, the message was clear. These weren't your average warriors. Berserkers were built different. They were chosen, feared, revered. They weren't just men who fought. They were weapons of the gods, sharpened by rage and ritual. Descriptions of their behaviour border on the supernatural. They'd bite their shields, foam at the mouth, shake uncontrollably. It was said they would enter a trance-like state called berserkergang, the berserker's rage, where they lost all sense of pain, fear, even humanity. Think about it. In a time when most people avoided combat unless absolutely necessary, here were men eager to throw themselves into the fray with no protection. They didn't just break enemy lines, they shattered them. Berserkers would charge into a shield wall like a living battering ram, smashing their way through enemy ranks while howling like wolves and swinging their axes with wild, reckless abandon. And they weren't just battlefield anomalies, kings used them. In fact, Harald Fairhair, the first king of Norway, reportedly kept berserkers as his personal shock troops and royal guard. They weren't cannon fodder, they were elite. Imagine being in a village targeted for a Viking raid. You might survive a regular warrior, but if you saw a berserker among them, you knew this was no ordinary fight. It was a storm with teeth. The berserker wasn't just a fighter, he was an idea, a living embodiment of unfiltered rage and divine madness. And for those who witnessed it, it was unforgettable. If history remembers the berserkers as warriors, it's the sagas that made them legends. The Viking sagas weren't just bedtime stories, they were oral traditions, passed down from skald to skald, part historical record, part campfire epic and all drama. And when it came to painting pictures of larger-than-life characters, the berserkers stole the show. Take Egil's saga, for example, one of the most gripping family sagas in all of Norse literature. Egil's father, Skallagrim, was a berserker. There's a scene where he's playing a board game, yes, a board game, and loses his temper so violently that he falls into berserker rage. He attacks his opponent and nearly kills him on the spot. Imagine getting so mad at Monopoly you fly into a divine war trance. That was berserker energy. Then there's Hrolf Krati's saga. This one reads like a Norse Avengers film. Hrolf's elite warriors, his berserkers, are described as the fiercest men in the land. In battle, they go into such a frenzy that their skin turns dark, their strength triples, and they literally become unstoppable until the rage burns itself out. In the saga of the Volsungs, berserkers appear again, this time more like divine instruments of wrath. They serve kings, challenge heroes, and go head-to-head with other supernatural beings. They're less human and more like nature's fury given form. But the sagas didn't always glorify them. Some tales show berserkers as uncontrollable, even dangerous. In the saga of the Inglings, King Eric Bloodaxe uses berserkers in battle. But later he has to kill some of them because they became too violent, attacking civilians and allies when their rage wouldn't stop. See, the berserker was both hero and threat. The sagas walked that line carefully. On one hand, they were the ultimate warriors. On the other, they were a reminder of what happens when rage replaces reason. What's fascinating is how consistently these traits show up. Shield biting, howling, trance-like states, superhuman strength. Whether the berserker was a villain or a champion, the legend was always the same. They were more than men. They were touched by the gods or by madness. And those tales, they outlived the warriors themselves. Long after the last berserker swung an axe, his spirit lived on in the words of the skalds, etched into Viking memory like a scar. So were berserkers real? Or were they just products of wild Viking imagination? Let's step out of the sagas for a moment and into the world of historical accounts and archaeology. Because believe it or not, even outside of storytelling, berserkers did leave traces behind. First, let's talk about Thorbjorn Hornklofi, a 9th century skald, basically a Viking court poet. He described berserkers in the service of King Harald Fairhair, Norway's first monarch. Hornklofi's verses say they bit their shields and were mad like dogs or wolves, immune to fire and iron. It's poetic, sure, but this was a contemporary source, not a fantasy novel. Another Norse writer, Snorri Sturluson, echoed the same descriptions in his 13th century work, the Heimskringla. He referred to berserkers as Odin's warriors, who entered a violent trance where they could not distinguish friend from foe, fighting blindly, sometimes until death. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Foreign sources mentioned berserkers too. John Skylitzes, a Byzantine historian, described Viking warriors in the Varangian Guard, the emperor's elite troops, who fought with such ferocity and fearlessness that they terrified their enemies. Sound familiar? So that's the literary record. But what about the physical evidence? Well, archaeologists haven't found any tombstone that says, "Here lies Olaf the Berserker." But what we do have are clues. Take the Torsunda plates found in Sweden. These bronze stamp moulds date to the 6th or 7th century and depict a masked warrior in a dramatic pose, possibly dancing or invoking transformation, right next to a wolf-like beast. Many scholars interpret this as a berserker ritual or totemic ceremony. Then there's the presence of animal bones, especially bear and wolf, found in warrior graves. Not just tossed in, but carefully placed, suggesting spiritual or symbolic significance. Some warriors were buried with bear claws, canine teeth, or wolf pelts, hinting at a deeper connection between the warrior and the animal spirit they believed they embodied. We've also uncovered pendants and amulets showing warriors with animal heads or surrounded by wolves. These items weren't decorative. They were likely used in ritual or to invoke the strength of a totem animal, especially before battle. So no, there's no glowing berserker sword in a museum. But when you add up the poetic descriptions, the foreign accounts, and the spiritual artifacts buried with Viking warriors, it becomes clear berserkers weren't just mythical, they were very, very real. And to their enemies, they were a nightmare in fur. So, how does someone go berserk? We're not just talking about yelling a bit louder or getting extra angry. Berserkers entered what the Norse called berserksganga, a full-on, trance-like battle frenzy where they lost all fear, ignored pain, and became a terrifying force of destruction. But what actually triggered that transformation? Let's dive into the theories. Theory 1. Psychological conditioning. Some experts believe berserkers trained themselves into this state. Through deep breathing, rhythmic chanting, and isolation, they may have induced a self-hypnotic state. Something like what we see in tribal war dances or martial rituals in other warrior cultures. The repeated rituals along with battle stress and adrenaline, could have pushed them past the point of fear and pain into something like controlled madness. Theory 2. Natural temperament and trauma. Let's not forget many Viking warriors lived brutal lives, constant violence, early exposure to death. It's possible berserkers were individuals with extreme aggression, psychotic disorders, or what we'd now call post-traumatic stress. Back then, there were no diagnoses, only outcomes. If someone showed violent tendencies, they weren't sent to therapy. They were handed an axe and told to fight for Odin. Theory 3. Chemical enhancement. This one's gotten the most attention. Some historians propose that berserkers used hallucinogenic substances before battle. The most famous suspect? Amanita muscaria, that iconic red-capped mushroom with white spots. Consuming it can cause visual distortions, muscle twitching, sweating, and aggressive behaviour. In the right dose, it could make someone feel invincible or out of control. Other possibilities include henbane, a toxic herb known to induce delusions, overheating, and violent outbursts. The Vikings were expert herbalists. They knew which plants to use and how to survive them. Even alcohol, consumed in sacred pre-battle rituals, could have played a role. Some sagas mention drinking before fighting. Mead mixed with herbs or hallucinogens might have helped warriors flip the switch into a more savage state of mind. So was it drugs, trauma, ritual? Probably all three. Imagine a man who's already aggressive. Add spiritual belief that he's channeling a bear, then feed him a psychoactive mushroom stew, put a wolf pelt on his back and send him screaming into a battlefield. Yeah, that's how you get a berserker. But here's the real kicker. Whatever method they used, the result was real. Enemies fled. Friends feared them. And their legend has lasted over 1,000 years. To understand the berserker, you've got to understand the Viking mindset. For the Norse, war wasn't just survival. It was spiritual. Every swing of the sword, every death in battle, every howl into the night was part of a larger cosmic story. And the berserker, he was one of its most sacred, terrifying characters. These weren't just madmen, they were holy warriors. In Norse mythology, the god Odin stood at the crossroads of wisdom, war, and madness. He was the All-Father, the one who sacrificed an eye for knowledge, but also the one who whispered into the ears of kings before battle and sent Valkyries to claim the worthy dead. Berserkers were seen as his chosen, gifted with divine rage, the ability to cross the boundary between man and beast, and to walk the fine line between life and death. Then there were the Ulfhedna, less famous but closely related. They weren't bear men, they were wolf men, warriors who donned wolf skins and howled under the moon before charging into battle. Unlike berserkers, who were often solo fury incarnate, Ulfhedna sometimes fought in organised packs. Still Odin's men, still terrifying. It's likely that Ulfhedna and berserkers were part of the same warrior cult, groups of elite fighters who trained, meditated, and fought under animal totems. In Norse cosmology, to become the beast wasn't shameful. It was divine. It showed strength, courage, and devotion to the gods. Even their gear had religious significance. Animal pelts weren't just clothing, they were totemic armour, a symbolic act of transformation. Wearing a bear or wolf skin meant you weren't merely invoking that animal, you were becoming it. The boundary between human and beast blurred in the heat of battle, and to the Vikings, that was power. But the berserker's connection to Odin wasn't always safe. Remember, Odin was also the god of chaos, madness. He was revered, but feared. Those who followed him too closely often walked a razor-thin edge between spiritual warrior and uncontrollable danger. As Christianity began to spread, that edge became a line, and soon crossing it would come with consequences. As Christianity spread through the north, the old ways were branded as pagan savagery. Berserkers, once elite warriors and spiritual icons, became outlaws. By the 11th century, going berserk wasn't just frowned upon, it was illegal. The Icelandic law code Gragas explicitly forbids berserk behaviour. Those who went berserk were seen as a danger to society. They were no longer holy warriors, they were criminals. The once feared berserkers faded into legend. Their ranks disbanded, their rights outlawed. But their legacy didn't vanish. You may never face a Viking horde in real life, but chances are you've already met a berserker. They're everywhere in pop culture. In comics, you've got Thor's battle fury and Wolverine's berserker rage. In games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, you can literally play as a Viking warrior channeling animal fury. In anime, movies, and fantasy novels, the rage-fueled fighter is a classic trope, one that goes straight back to the berserkers of old. Even professional wrestling has borrowed the name. Remember the Berserker from the WWF? A wild, yelling Norseman stomping around the ring. Over the top? Definitely. But inspired by history? Absolutely. And it's not just characters. The very word berserk is still part of our everyday language. When someone goes berserk, we mean they've lost control, entered a frenzy, become violent or irrational. That phrase has survived over 1,000 years. And it's still going strong. Not bad for a bunch of half-naked warriors from the frozen north, but their legacy runs deeper than pop culture. Berserkers force us to confront the thin line between courage and chaos, between the divine and the dangerous. They remind us that even the most terrifying parts of history can echo in the stories we tell, the words we use, and the heroes we imagine. Because sometimes rage isn't just emotion, it's legend. So who were the berserkers, really? Warriors, shamans, madmen? All of the above? They stood at the crossroads of fear and reverence, myth and history, whether they were channeling spirits, consuming hallucinogens, or just masters of psychological warfare. One thing's certain, the berserkers left their mark. On battlefields, on sagas, on the memory of a world that still marvels at their fury. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into Viking history, leave a like, drop a comment, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales from the age of axes and legends. Until next time, keep your shield up. You never know when a berserker might charge.